In November 2013, a team led by geneticist Eske Willerslev sequenced the genome of a small child buried more than 24,000 years ago near a village called Malta in south-central Siberia, close to Lake Baikal, and when the results came back, the scientists almost threw them out. The DNA showed mitochondrial haplogroup U and Y, chromosome markers typically associated with Europeans, and the team's first instinct was that the sample had been contaminated by whoever had handled the bones in the decades since they were excavated in the 1920s. That's the normal, boring explanation for an anomaly like this. Contamination happens constantly in ancient DNA work, and any lab that has spent time around old bones knows to be suspicious of a result that looks too strange. So they set the sample aside, checked it again, and then checked a second Siberian individual from a nearby site called Afontova Gora. The same signal showed up. Two separate individuals, buried thousands of years apart, both carrying genetic ancestry that had no business being in Siberia, according to everything scientists thought they knew about how humans had spread across Asia. That was the moment MA1, the boy from Malta, stopped being a contamination problem and became one of the most important skeletons in the history of population genetics. He turned out to be neither European nor East Asian. He belonged to something else entirely, a population that had vanished so completely from the historical and archaeological record that nobody had known to look for it. Scientists now call that population the Ancient North Eurasians, or ANE, and this is a story about what happened after they found it, about the astonishing places their DNA turns up today, and about a detail that nobody expected. When researchers actually reconstructed what this ghost population looked like, the results were not what the popular imagination wanted them to be. If you care about where the traits on your own face actually come from, and how easily a good story can outrun the actual evidence, stay with me, because this one has both. Here's what makes the Malta boy so strange. His mitochondrial DNA belonged to a haplogroup U, a lineage that shows up at extremely high frequency in Ice Age European hunter-gatherers. His Y chromosome lineage was ancestral to modern Western Eurasian populations, and yet he was found 4,000 miles east of Europe, in the heart of Siberia, in a burial dated to roughly 24,000 years ago, wrapped in ochre with an ivory pendant and a bead necklace in a period called the last glacial maximum, when most of northern Asia was locked under ice sheets and permafrost. When Willerslev's team ran the comparisons, they found something even stranger. MA1 was not simply a stray European who had wandered improbably far east. He was basal to both Western Eurasians and remarkably to Native Americans, sharing somewhere between 14 and 38% of his genome with people living in the Americas today. Despite having no close genetic relationship to East Asians, the population every prior model assumed was the sole ancestral source of the first Americans. In other words, this one Siberian child rewrote the family tree of the Western Hemisphere. He represented a population that existed before the genetic split we now recognize as European versus East Asian had even hardened into place. A population that later contributed DNA to Europeans, to the ancestors of Native Americans, and, as it turns out, to people scattered in surprising pockets clear across Central and North Asia today. A second individual, Afontova Gora II, dated to roughly 17,000 years ago, confirmed the pattern and later finds pushed the story even further back to a site called Yana in far northeastern Siberia, dating to around 31,000 years ago, showing that populations related to this lineage had been living and surviving in the Siberian Arctic for an extraordinarily long stretch of the Ice Age. Researchers now think the ancient North Eurasians themselves form from an earlier admixture event, a blending of a Western Eurasian lineage, the kind represented by Upper Paleolithic Europeans, and an Eastern Eurasian lineage related to early populations in China that met somewhere in Siberia or Central Asia tens of thousands of years ago and produced something new, not fully Western, not fully Eastern. A hinge population sitting at the geographic and genetic crossroads of the continent right around the time the last ice age was tightening its grip on the northern hemisphere. Now here's the twist, and it's the part almost nobody puts in the thumbnail. When scientists tried to reconstruct what MA1 actually looked like, using the same pigmentation genetics that let forensic researchers predict eye and hair color from a DNA sample, the picture that came back was not light eyes, not something exotic and golden. The reconstruction, published by researchers including Raghavan and colleagues in 2014 and refined further by Fu and colleagues in 2016, suggested MA1 most likely had brown eyes, dark hair, and skin pigmentation consistent with populations adapted to less UV exposure than tropical latitudes, but nothing resembling the pale, light-eyed Ice Age European image that shows up in a lot of popular science content. The caveat researchers themselves flagged as important. This reconstruction is based on a single, low-coverage ancient genome, and pigmentation prediction from ancient DNA carries real uncertainty, so nobody should treat it as absolute. But it is the actual data we have, and it complicates any tidy story where the ghost population hands down a specific eye color like a family heirloom. Whatever the deep roots of unusual eye colors across Asia turn out to be, they are not a simple, direct inheritance from a single light-eyed ancestor 24,000 years ago. The real story is messier, slower, and in some ways more interesting than that. So let's get into where ancient North Eurasian ancestry actually shows up today, because this part is genuinely well established. It's not concentrated in one place. It's scattered, diluted, and layered into populations across an enormous stretch of the map in wildly different proportions. Native Americans carry some of the highest levels of A&E-related ancestry of any population on Earth, in the range of 30 to 40% by some estimates, inherited through the same lineage that contributed to MA1's genome, mixing with East Asian-related ancestry somewhere in Siberia or Beringia before the first migrations into the Americas. Northern Europeans carry a smaller but still meaningful A&E signal, delivered not directly from Siberia, but through a relay. A&E ancestry moved into Eastern European hunter-gatherer populations, and those populations then contributed heavily to the Yamnaya, the Bronze Age steppe pastoralists, whose massive westward migrations around 5,000 years ago reshaped the genetic makeup of Europe, and are now linked by most researchers to the spread of Indo-European languages. Modern Europeans typically carry somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% A&E-derived ancestry today, folded in through that steppe migration. And then there's the part of the map that gets far less attention, Siberia and Central Asia, where some populations carry a startlingly high proportion of this ancestry. A 2017 genome study of indigenous Siberian populations found that Western Siberian groups trace as much as 57% of their ancestry to the ancient North Eurasian lineage represented by MA1, among the highest proportions documented anywhere. Populations like the Kets, an isolated group living along the Yenisei River, and other small Siberian communities carry A&E ancestry at levels that rival or exceed what's found in Native Americans. Meanwhile, research has consistently found that the A&E signal is essentially absent, or present only at very low background levels in East and Southeast Asian populations further south and east, in places like Han Chinese, Japanese, and Southeast Asian groups whose ancestry traces overwhelmingly to a different, more southerly East Asian lineage that appears to have been comparatively insulated from the deep mixing events that shaped Siberia and the Central Asian steppe. That's an important detail, because it means A&E ancestry in Asia isn't a uniform Asian signal at all. It's geographically lumpy, concentrated in the north and the Central Asian interior, and thinning out dramatically as you move toward the Pacific coast. This is where the Central Asian populations that get singled out for unusual eye colors actually come into the picture, and the real genetic history here is remarkable enough without embellishment. Take the Tarim Basin in what is now China's Xinjiang region, home to some of the most extraordinary archaeological finds in Asia. Naturally mummified bodies, some over 4,000 years old, preserved in the extreme dryness of the Taklamakan Desert, several with hair color and facial features that struck early researchers as strikingly unlike their neighbors. For decades, popular theory held that these mummies represented a wave of migrants from far to the west, possibly from the Eurasian steppe or even from populations related to early Indo-Europeans. Then, in 2021, a large ancient DNA study published in Nature completely overturned that assumption. The Tarim mummies weren't recent immigrants from a distant steppe population at all. Genetically, they descended overwhelmingly from a local population with deep roots in the region, one that carried a substantial component of ancient North Eurasian ancestry, the same deep Siberian-linked lineage traced back to MA1, mixed with local ancestry going back thousands of years, largely without the recent steppe pastoralist or East Asian admixture that later shaped much of the surrounding region. In other words, whatever unusual features those mummies displayed weren't imported. They were homegrown, the visible residue of an extremely old layer of ancestry that had simply persisted in that pocket of desert basin, relatively undiluted, while surrounding populations underwent wave after wave of later mixing. Modern Uyghur populations in Xinjiang carry a genuinely complex ancestry profile, generally modeled as a mixture of Eastern Eurasian and Western Eurasian-related components, the product of the region's position for thousands of years at the crossroads of trade and migration between East Asia, Central Asia, and the Iranian Plateau. Genome-wide studies have estimated the admixture proportions at roughly half Eastern-related and half Western-related ancestry on average, though individual variation is considerable, and this mixing appears to have been ongoing for thousands of years rather than being a single recent event. That admixture history helps explain why lighter and unusual eye colors appear more frequently in some Uyghur communities than in populations further east, though it's worth being honest that rigorous population representative studies quantifying exact eye color frequencies in this specific population are much thinner on the ground than the ancestry studies themselves. A lot of the specific percentage figures that circulate online for how many Uyghurs have amber eyes trace back to informal observation rather than peer-reviewed measurement, and that distinction matters if we're trying to be accurate rather than just compelling. The Hazara people of Afghanistan and Pakistan present a different but equally striking case. Their distinctive appearance, often including lighter eye colors that stand out against the surrounding populations of the region, has long been popularly attributed entirely to descent from the armies of Genghis Khan in the 13th century. Genetic studies have confirmed there is real Mongolian-related ancestry in the Hazara genome, detectable Y chromosome lineages and autosomal signals consistent with that historical narrative. But that Mongolian component doesn't fully explain the picture. Hazara genetic studies also show substantial ancestry connected to populations of the ancient Iranian plateau and the Bactria margiana region of Central Asia, home to sophisticated Bronze Age urban cultures dating back over 4,000 years, well before the Mongol conquests, and layered further back still with detectable deep Central Asian ancestry connected to the broader ancient North Eurasian related gene pool found across the region. So the honest version of the Hazara story isn't Mongol soldiers, full stop. It's a genetic palimpsest. Bronze Age Central Asian populations, later Mongol era, admixture, and an even older underlying layer, all stacked on top of each other over thousands of years, with the visible traits we notice today being the accumulated residue of that whole layered history rather than any single event. Then there's the Kalash people of the Hindu Kush mountains in northern Pakistan, one of the most genetically distinctive populations in South Asia, and one that gets cited constantly in discussions of unusual eye colors in the region, sometimes with more mythology attached than evidence. Kalash oral tradition includes claims of descent from soldiers of Alexander the Great, a story that's culturally significant, but that genetic studies have not supported in any straightforward way. What the genetic data does show is that the Kalash are a small, long isolated population with a distinct genetic profile relative to their South Asian neighbors, carrying ancestry connected to ancient Eurasian lineages associated with populations that also contributed to Europeans and to broader Central Asian groups, likely preserved through centuries of relative reproductive isolation in their mountain valleys, rather than through any recent single-source migration event. Isolation is the key mechanism here, not exotic origin. Small populations that don't mix much with their neighbors tend to retain older genetic signals, including rare trait variants, at frequencies that look startling compared to larger, more thoroughly mixed populations around them. It's worth pausing here to talk about what eye color genetics actually tells us, because this is where a lot of popular science content, including a good deal of what circulates about amber eyes specifically, quietly stops being rigorous. The best understood part of human eye color genetics involves a region on chromosome 15 containing two neighboring genes, OCA2 and HARC2. OCA2 produces a protein involved in the maturation of melanosomes, the cellular structures that manufacture and store melanin, the primary pigment responsible for eye, skin, and hair color. HARC2 sits right next to OCA2 and contains a regulatory switch, a specific single-letter DNA variant that controls how much OCA2 gets expressed. Research has traced the blue eye version of that switch to a single mutation that most researchers estimate arose somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, likely in a single ancestral individual near the Black Sea region, a mutation that dramatically reduces OCA2 expression and, with it, the amount of melanin deposited in the iris. That single mutation is the reason essentially every blue-eyed person on Earth today shares a detectable genetic connection going back to that one ancient carrier. And it's also part of the reason the blue eye trait spread across Europe alongside the later steppe migrations that also carried ancient North Eurasian ancestry westward. Amber eyes do not have that same clean origin story, and it's important to say that plainly, rather than manufacture a false parallel. Where blue eyes trace to one identifiable mutation with a fairly well-dated origin, the golden coppery coloring of amber eyes appears to result from a different mechanism, a relatively higher concentration of a yellow-toned pigment called lipochrome, sometimes described as pheomelanin, combined with comparatively low levels of the brown eumelanin that dominates in typical brown eyes. Researchers studying the OCA2 HERC2 region and related pigmentation genes, including TYR and other modifier genes on different chromosomes, have found that amber coloration involves a more complicated, still incompletely mapped combination of variants, rather than a single defining mutation researchers can point to and date the way they can with the blue eye switch. Because amber eyes don't depend on the same HERC2 variant that produces blue eyes, they can and do appear in populations where blue eyes are essentially absent, which is exactly why amber shows up sporadically across parts of Africa, South America, and Asia, places with very little of the specific European-linked blue eye mutation, but where other combinations of pigment-related genes still occasionally line up to produce that golden hue. The honest scientific position right now is that amber eye genetics is a real but still actively studied area, not a settled one with a tidy origin story. And any content that tells you it traces cleanly back to one 24,000-year-old Siberian ancestor is reaching well past what the actual research supports. That doesn't mean the deep ancestry angle is worthless, though. It just means it has to be handled more carefully than a single dramatic gene. What the ancient North Eurasian research does robustly establish is that populations across Siberia, Central Asia, and parts of South Asia carry a genuine, well-documented, deeply ancient genetic layer that is measurably distinct from the ancestry of neighboring East and Southeast Asian populations, and that this layer predates any of the more commonly cited explanations like Silk Road trade contact, Mongol-era conquest, or Russian colonial-era intermixing in Siberia. The Silk Road absolutely did move genes as well as goods, and its role in shaping the ancestry of Central Asian populations over the last 2,000 years is well documented and real. But when researchers trace the deepest layers in the genomes of populations like the Kets, the Buryat of the Lake Baikal region, or the ancient Tarim Basin population, they're finding signals that go back tens of thousands of years, long before any trade route existed, long before written history, long before the empires and migrations that people usually reach for as an easy explanation. Lake Baikal itself sits right in the middle of this picture. During the last glacial maximum, the region around the lake was one of the few parts of interior Siberia that remained habitable, functioning as what geneticists call a refugium, a pocket where human populations survived the harshest stretch of the Ice Age while much of the surrounding territory became too cold and dry to sustain life. Populations that sheltered in refugia like this tend to leave an outsized genetic footprint on later populations, precisely because they were among the few surviving sources when the ice retreated and people began expanding and remixing again. The Ainu people of Hokkaido, in northern Japan, offer another genuinely documented thread, though again one that deserves careful framing. The Ainu descend in significant part from the Jomon hunter-gatherer populations that inhabited the Japanese archipelago for tens of thousands of years before agricultural Yayoi populations arrived from the Asian mainland roughly 2,800 years ago and became the dominant ancestral source for most mainland Japanese people today. Ancient DNA from Jomon-era skeletal remains shows a genetic profile distinct from later mainland East Asian populations, with some studies noting affinities to older, more southerly coastal Asian lineages, and modern populations with elevated Jomon ancestry, including the Ainu and some Ryukyu island populations, carry a genetic signature that stands apart from the rest of Japan. What researchers have not established with any rigor is a direct quantified link between that Jomon ancestry and elevated rates of amber or hazel eye color specifically. That connection shows up frequently in casual and popular accounts, but it hasn't been demonstrated through the kind of controlled, peer-reviewed population study that would make it a solid scientific claim rather than an intriguing but unverified pattern. The same caution applies to reports of unusual eye colors, occasionally surfacing in genetic studies of Korean and other East Asian populations. It is true that ancestry testing and academic population genetics have gradually gotten better at detecting faint, ancient admixture signals that older, cruder reference panels would have missed or written off as noise, and it's entirely plausible that some individuals across East Asia carry small, diluted traces of very old ancestral layers that never fully vanished, even after thousands of years of mixing with later, more dominant East Asian populations. But turning some individuals carry faint ancient signals into this specific person's amber eyes prove ancient Siberian descent is a leap the current science doesn't support. Eye color is influenced by more than a dozen genes. Environmental factors like sunlight exposure play a documented role in how pigmentation appears and even shifts slightly with age. And a rare trait can and does arise independently in unrelated lineages through ordinary genetic variation, without requiring an exotic ancestral explanation at all. So where does that leave the actual answer to where amber eyes in Asia come from? It leaves us with something less like a single cinematic reveal and more like a genuinely layered history, which, if anything, is more scientifically satisfying once you sit with it. Populations across Siberia, the Central Asian interior, the Tarim Basin, the Hindu Kush, and pockets of the Himalayas carry real, well-documented ancient genetic contributions from a deep Siberian lineage that predates the modern categories of European and East Asian by tens of thousands of years, a lineage first identified through the genome of a child buried near Lake Baikal 24,000 years ago, and now traced with increasing precision through dozens of ancient and modern genomes across the continent. That deep ancestry is real, it's peer-reviewed, and it has reshaped how population geneticists understand the settlement of Siberia, Central Asia, and the Americas. What is not established with the same rigor is a clean, single-gene explanation connecting that ancestry directly to amber eye color specifically, because amber eyes themselves arise from a more diffuse, still incompletely mapped set of genetic variants that can and do appear independently in populations with very different ancestral histories, from South America to sub-Saharan Africa to South Asia, places with essentially no ancient North Eurasian ancestry at all. The most honest version of this story is that if you have amber eyes and ancestry connected to Central or North Asia, you may well be carrying threads of one of the oldest, most consequential population layers ever recovered by ancient DNA research, a population that helped seed the ancestry of Native Americans, shaped the genetic makeup of Bronze Age Central Asia, and left its clearest surviving traces in isolated pockets from the Siberian taiga to the Tarim Basin desert. But your eye color specifically is the product of a much more universal and much less exotic biological lottery. The same tangled interaction of a dozen-plus genes that produces rare eye colors in every population on Earth, regardless of what ancient ghosts happen to be sitting quietly in the rest of your genome. That's not a less interesting story than the one about a single golden-eyed ancestral tribe. It's just a truer one, and the deep past it points to, written in Ice Age Siberia and Bronze Age Central Asia, is remarkable enough without needing anything added to it. If stories like this one, grounded in the real published science of ancient DNA rather than the embellished version, are what you're here for, subscribe, because there is a lot more of this deep ancestry record still being uncovered, one ancient genome at a time.